The war took away his love, but not his words. Some stories don't need big battles to be eternal. They are born in the silence of a letter, in the warmth of a memory, in the muffled sound of a goodbye that never wanted to be said. This is one of those stories. It's not just about war, shooting or trenches. It's about what resists even when everything falls apart. About what remains when everything goes away. It's about love, but not just any love. A love that writes, that bleeds, and that even alone continues to speak, even if no one responds. In times where the world seemed to have lost its way, and where men were torn from their homes with no promise of return, a connection was born between two hearts that not even the noise of cannons could silence. And it was amid fear and uncertainty that he decided to write, every day, as if his life depended on those words. Maybe because, in fact, it depended. Every dawn, between grenades and gunfire, he found a moment of peace, a gap between the horrors of war where his soul escaped the battlefield and flew to her his hope, his refuge, his reason. And even though she never responded, he never stopped writing. This is the story of a love that war tried to destroy, but that found an invincible trench in words. A story written on paper stained with mud and blood, but with ink made of tenderness. A love that survived silence, distance, pain, and time. You're about to meet the man who turned absence into poetry, and the woman who, without even knowing it, was the lighthouse that kept him alive. Get ready to travel through time, not with machines or portals, but with letters, with feelings, with memory. In this video, we will tell in 13 chapters the journey of a soldier who was not forgotten because his words remained. Let's relive every detail, from the day he left to the moment his letters finally reached the hands of the woman he loved. This is more than a video. It's a letter to the past. It is a living reminder that true love writes, waits, and endures. Because even when everything is lost, when the world falls apart, there are still words left. His name was Konstantin Orlov, a 23-year-old Russian born in the quiet hills of Smolensk, son of a literature professor and a seamstress with the soul of an artist. He grew up among books, fabrics, and stories. From an early age, he learned that words could be sharper than swords, stronger than armies, more loyal than promises. Konstantin was a boy with dreamy eyes and a restless soul. While his colleagues were chasing adventures or preparing for the rigors of military life, he spent entire afternoons hunched over a notebook, writing poems for no one. He loved life with the intensity of those who know it is brief, and maybe that's why he wrote, to try to hold it a little longer. He was not a war hero. He did not carry in his chest the thirst for glory, nor the steely courage of great generals. His uniform didn't suit him, and his gun shook in his hands. But there was something about Konstantin that made him different. He loved with words, and that, at that time, was a form of resistance. His room was lined with yellowed sheets of unfinished poems, statements that were never sent, chronicles of dreams that would never come true. But among all those words, there was one that was repeated more than all: Yelena. Yelena was the name that made his heart race, even when there was no war. The girl with copper-colored hair, the light laugh, and the deep gaze. She lived 2 streets down from his grandmother's house, and since childhood, she robbed him of his peace. And at the same time, it was the only place where he found her. They grew up together, but it was at the age of 17 that he discovered he could no longer live without her. The first letter he wrote to Yelena was simple, almost shy. A note hidden inside a book she borrowed. In it, it said, "If you open this page, you will find my heart." She read it and smiled. And from that day on, they never stopped speaking to each other in words. Even when they were side by side, they still exchanged letters, as if written words had a special power, a purer way of loving. When the war began, Konstantin knew he would be drafted. It wasn't a choice, it was an imposed destiny. But, unlike so many others who left with promises to return as heroes, he only had one certainty: he would write to her every day. Because if words were what brought them together, then they were what kept them alive. The day before he left, he didn't cry, but he wrote a 6-page letter, not of farewell, but of love. In it, it said, "I don't know when I'll be back, or if I'll be back, but you'll have me in every line, in every paper, in every word. The war may silence my voice, but it will never silence my love for you." Konstantin took with him a small leather-bound notebook. It was Yelena's gift, something so he wouldn't get lost in the noise of the world. Every day of combat, every break, between marches, he opened that notebook and wrote, even when I was exhausted, even when I could barely hold the pen. He wrote about the biting cold, about the smell of gunpowder, about the friends he made and the ones he lost. But, above all, I wrote about her, about how he dreamed of the smell of Yelena's hair, about how her smile was the only thing that still made him smile. I wrote to keep from going crazy, to remember who he was. To the other soldiers, it seemed crazy, but little by little, they began to understand. Konstantin's letters became a refuge for them too. He read excerpts to his companions before going to sleep, as if they were prayers, and, in a way, they were. Because Konstantin, the soldier who loved writing, didn't just wield a gun, he wielded hope. And in the heart of everyone who heard him, a memory arose, a face, a name, a longing. He reminded them who they were fighting for. The young man with hands dirty with dirt, but a soul clean with love, went far beyond a number among thousands of soldiers. He was living proof that, even in the midst of the deepest darkness, there are still those who insist on writing by candlelight, because you believe that on the other side, someone is still reading. Her name was Yelena Mirova. He was 22 years old when the war began, but his eyes already bore the maturity of someone who knew life's losses from an early age. Raised by a widowed grandmother in a small village on the banks of the Volga, Yelena grew up among the smell of fresh bread, stories told by the fire, and the certainty that love, when true, was stronger than distance, pain, or time. She was no ordinary woman, although she tried to be. While the other girls were worried about dresses or suitors, Yelena walked around with her pockets full of books and her heart full of questions. She worked as a teacher at the village school, teaching children to write their own names, and to dream of a world they might never see. But, above all, she carried within her an almost sacred patience, a rare kind of hope that didn't scream, didn't demand, just waited. It was in this waiting that Konstantin came into her life. They met when they were children, but only really saw each other when they were 16. One day, he left a book on the bench in the square where she liked to read. Inside was a note with unfinished verses and a name scrawled in the corner, K. Orlov. Yelena smiled, not because of the poem, but because, somehow, she felt that those words had been written for her. It didn't take long for the two to start exchanging letters, even though they lived in the same village. They wrote because, deep down, they knew that words carried things that eyes and gestures could not. Their love was not made of vows, but of pages. Each card, a construction. Each note, a step towards something the two were building together. A love that knew how to wait. When Konstantin was summoned, Yelena did not cry. Instead, she sewed herself a small leather-bound notebook and handed it to him with a single sentence embroidered on the inside, so that you never get lost in the noise of the world. It was his way of saying he could go, but he would take everything she was with him. After he left, Yelena lived between the school and the window. He taught the children in the morning, wrote letters in the afternoon, and in the evening he sat by the fire, rereading everything they had exchanged since the beginning. His home became a little sanctuary of words. Carefully folded letters, pieces of paper that smelled of longing, and envelopes that held more than ink. They held his faith. But time is a sneaky enemy. The weeks turned into months, and the months, years. At first, Konstantin's letters arrived almost daily. Then they became scarce. Finally, they stopped. But Yelena kept waiting. Not because she was naive, but because she believed that true love is not an exchange, it is a promise. As the surrounding village filled with grieving widows and mothers, she kept the table set for two. He never took his mug off the shelf. He never stopped writing a line a day, even though he knew he might never read it again. There were those who said she was crazy, but deep down, everyone admired her. Because Yelena wasn't just a woman in love. She was the living memory of a man the war tried to erase. It was resistance in the form of tenderness. While the world tried to move on, she refused to forget. And that made her, paradoxically, stronger than everyone. She never knew what had happened to him. No official news has been received. No confirmation, no final letter. Just silence. A silence that, for many, would be enough to give up. But not for her. Because in the silence, she still heard his voice. On cold mornings, I still felt the warmth of the words he left behind. Years later, when someone finally knocked on her door with a package in their hands and eyes full of memories, Yelena understood that her wait had not been in vain. Because true love, even if it has no return, is not waste. It is a seed. Yelena Mirova was, above all, fertile soil. A land where Konstantin's words could flourish even after the storm of war. A woman who didn't need a happy ending to believe in love. Because she knew, some loves are not meant to end, they are meant to continue. The morning Konstantin left began like all the others. The sun was still hiding behind the cold March fog, and the streets of the small village slept in silence. But there was something in the air, a stillness that wasn't peace. It was prelude. Yelena woke up before the first rooster crowed, as if her heart knew what her eyes didn't yet see. Konstantin arrived at her house soon after. He was wearing a grey army uniform, new, stiff, still smelling of mothballs. He seemed smaller inside it, like he was trying to hide. The eyes, normally alive, were cloudy. There were no tears. There was something deeper, the gravity of someone who knows they are going without. The guarantee of returning. Yelena opened the door with shaking hands, but a firm face. She already knew. They didn't need to say it. The world spoke for them. The radios, the newspapers, the notices glued to the posts. The whole world was going to war, and now it was Konstantin's turn. They didn't say much that morning. They didn't need to. It was the kind of silence that said more than 1,000 words. They walked together to the old oak tree near the school, the same one where they had kissed. For the first time, there, they sat side by side. And it was then that he handed her the letter. It was a long letter, written in the early hours of the morning. 6 carefully folded pages. The handwriting is firm, but accelerated, as if someone writes so as not to forget what they feel. In the letter, he did not say goodbye. He said, "See you later," but with the tenderness of someone who knows that this soon may never come. Yelena, if you are reading this now, it means the day has arrived. I'm going, but I'm not leaving, because my soul will continue with you every day. I don't know what I'll find out there. I only know what I leave here, and that's all. Everything I am is in you, and so, I promise, I will write every day, even if you can't answer me, even if the whole world says it's crazy. I need this, because loving you is what keeps me whole. Wait for me. But if you can't understand, my words will always find you. She didn't cry, not there, not in front of him. He just held the letter to his chest as if it were his own heart. And then she took a hand-stitched, leather-bound notebook from her bag and handed it to him. You're supposed to write everything. Write to me. Write about yourself, about what you feel, about what you fear, even if you never manage to send it to me. Promise you'll write. He nodded, eyes teary, but still firm. He picked up the notebook like someone receiving a piece of ground in a world in ruins. And it was then that the silence gave way. A whistle sounded in the distance. The military truck approached along the dirt road, raising dust and fate. They got up. They looked into each other's eyes, and without rehearsals, without speeches, without theater, they hugged each other. Strong, delayed, like someone who knows that that touch needed to last as long as it was absent. He kissed her forehead, and she, for the first time, allowed a tear to escape. Come back to me, he whispered. Every day, he replied, pointing to the notebook. I will be with you, every day. Konstantin climbed into the truck. He sat next to other boys who were also leaving everything behind. He looked for the last time at the village, at the oak, at her. Yelena remained there, motionless, like a statue of longing, with the letter clutched in his hand and his gaze fixed on that spot where he disappeared. That morning, nothing exploded, no shots were heard, no soldiers fell. But it was at that moment that the war began for both of them. Because it's not on the battlefield that love is most challenged. It's at a distance. It is in the silence that it screams. It's when you wait that you don't know how long it will last. From that day on, every sunrise would bring an absence. Every sound of the mail would be a ray of hope. And each word written would be a step on the invisible bridge he was trying to build on the other side of the war. To her, that morning, the world took his love, but she stuck with her words, and they would be his salvation. Before I continue, tell me one thing. Did you feel this? That pang in your chest, that desire to know what comes next? Because this is just the first heartbeat of this story. If you've come this far, it's because something touched you, and if it did, then leave your like now. This shows me that it's worth continuing to tell stories like this. And please subscribe to the channel, because what lies ahead is even more exciting. Trigger curiosity. I give you now. What if I tell you that even in the midst of the chaos of war, between bombs and blood, he continued writing every day? What if I told you that the letters he wrote became the only thread between life and death? You'll want to know this. You'll want to live it. Then don't leave the video, because in the next chapter you will see what few have seen. A love resisting between explosions, words escaping fear, a heart writing against the end. Stay with me, because in the next topic you will discover how his letters, in the midst of chaos, became more powerful than any weapon. Click like, sign up, activate the bell, and let's go together to the next chapter of the war. Took his love, but not his words. War has its own language made up of explosions, screams, short orders, and long silences. But Konstantin spoke another language, the language of written words, and it was through him that he resisted what many could not bear. On the battlefield, the notion of time disappears. The days are confused, the nights are haunted by gunshots and memories. But Konstantin had a ritual. Every day, without exception, I found a moment to write. It was like breathing, essential, vital, urgent. When the other soldiers smoked, slept, or surrendered to exhaustion, he sought shelter behind a rock, inside a trench, in the shade of a tree that survived the bombardment, and wrote. His leather-bound notebook, a gift from Yelena, was his only home. It was no longer a simple notebook. It was a reliquary, a sanctuary of feelings, a place where war did not enter. He wrote for her, but he also wrote for himself, because those words were the only part of him that remained whole. The first letters spoke of longing, of cold, of fear, how he could still hear her laugh in the quiet moments. He told about his battle companions, about the bad smells, about the long marches in the snow, but also about the stars, which still shone, even though men no longer saw them. As the days passed and Yelena's letters did not arrive, Konstantin's words became denser, not more desperate, just deeper. He didn't blame her silence. He understood that there was censorship, losses, chaos, but he kept writing as if she could feel, on the other side of the world, that he was still there, fighting, not just against the enemy, but against oblivion. In one of the letters he wrote, "Today, the fire fell closer than ever. The ground shook. A boy next to me was hit. Blood spattered my boot. But as the noise passed, I closed my eyes and imagined your face. Not the face in the photograph, the one in memory. The one that smiles when I pretend to understand poetry. I write, Yelena, because there is still something in me that has not died. And that something is you." He wrote every day, even if there was no way to send the letters. He kept everything in his notebook, folded the papers in his coat's inner pockets, hid notes in the soles of his boots, as if his words could survive even if he didn't. Other soldiers began to notice the habit. At first, they mocked. They said he was weak, a dreamer, that he should focus on surviving. But little by little, something changed. Konstantin's words began to spread across the fires. He read excerpts to his companions before going to sleep. Letters to Yelena became letters to all the women who had been left behind. Mothers, brides, daughters. A companion called Michael, a tough and skeptical sergeant, one night heard Konstantin read a letter and silently cried. The next day, he asked the young man to write something to his wife. He didn't know how. The hands that held rifles didn't know how to handle paper, but Konstantin, he knew, and so he became the scribe of a silent army of torn hearts. In the mud of the trenches, among the smell of gunpowder and burning flesh, verses, memories, small confessions flourished. The war had taken away almost everything but not his words, and they became shelter for many. One night, after an hours-long violent attack, he wrote, "Today I thought would be my last day, and the only thing I regretted was not being able to write more. Not for me, but for you, because my words are the only way I found to continue loving without touching you, to continue existing, even far away. If one day I don't write Yelena, it's because the world has finally shut me up. But until then, you'll have me, in every line." Even when he was injured, even when he could barely move his fingers from the cold, he wrote. His fingers were cracked, his hands were cut, but his pen, sometimes a lump of coal, other times a sharp nail dipped in improvised ink, was never missing. He made words his weapon, from feeling your trench. And even though he received no answers, he never stopped, because deep down, he knew there was someone waiting, even if he didn't say it, even if I could never read it. The simple act of writing was already a kind of encounter. Konstantin was no longer just a soldier. He was a survivor of the soul, a war poet, a lover with no return who refused to disappear, because as long as there was paper, there was still life, and as long as he wrote, she would exist with him even in the middle of hell. Yelena woke up every day to the same sound, the creaking of wood beneath her feet, the wind passing through the old windows, and, in the background, the echo of a hope that insisted on not dying. Since Konstantin left, she had transformed her routine into a kind of ritual, calmly. Brewed coffee, looking out the window, and then a visit to the post office, always with her heart in her hands. But the days piled up like dry leaves. The mail arrived, but never for her. No letter, no news, no words. At first, Yelena was trying to convince herself that it was just being late. After all, it was war. Everything was out of place. Maybe the letters were on their way. Maybe one day they would arrive all at once, like a gift from fate. But months passed, and nothing. Still, she continued writing. Every night, sitting at her grandmother's desk, by the light of the lamp, she poured onto paper what her heart could no longer keep on its own. I talked about the cold days, about the students at school, about how much I missed him, about the dreams I sometimes still had, and I woke up with a wet pillow. He said simple things, like don't forget to wear a scarf, and deep things like my love for you turned into resistance. She left these letters in the drawer. All I never knew where to send them. It had no address, just his name and the silence of the world. Sometimes he dreamed that a postman knocked on his door with a bundle of yellowed letters in his hands. I woke up with my heart racing, and the room still empty. Silence was not just absence, it was noise, a noise that screamed in the chest, a type of pain that no one saw, because on the outside, Yelena was the same, firm, polite, strong. But inside, she was fighting an invisible war, a war against time, against doubt, against oblivion. People around him started to comment, some with pity, others with harshness. Are you still waiting for him? Maybe he moved on. You are young, you should live, not hold on to an illusion. But she smiled, a sad but true smile, because I didn't wait with despair, I waited with love, and love is in no hurry. Yelena began to keep everything about Konstantin in a wooden box, locked with a key. The old letters, the handkerchief he forgot, the note from his first kiss, the flower pressed between the pages of a poetry book. It was his way of keeping his presence there, within the walls of the house. There were nights when she thought about giving up, in accepting silence as an answer, in letting the world move on and build a new story. But every time this idea came up, she felt like she betrayed something inside her, as if he were putting out, with his own hands, a flame that was still burning. Once, sitting in the backyard, looking at the stars, she murmured, "If you're alive, Konstantin, know that I'm here, and if you're not, write it somewhere in the sky, I'll know." Her silence was not coldness, it was a fight. It was a kind of mute hope, tired but still standing. Each day without news was an extra weight on the heart, but also a proof of love. Because loving someone without return is one of the purest forms of love. She started avoiding the mail. He began to walk around the village less, not out of shame, but to protect his own faith. He continued teaching at school, continued taking care of his grandmother, continued living, but with a part of him always focused on the past. Not because I didn't want to follow, but because I knew that, before moving on, I needed to honor what I experienced. Her silence was full of sound. The sound of memories, of promises, of "I'll be back," that still echoed in the corridors of memory. It was a silence that said, "I haven't forgotten you." It was the silence of those who still believe that love finds paths where there are no roads. She would never have imagined that, at that exact moment. On the other side of the continent, a man soaked in mud and gunpowder, with exhausted eyes and injured body, was writing letters to her with the same love that she put into the words she couldn't send. And perhaps, in some inexplicable way, the hearts were still connected. Maybe love, when true, finds a way to cross time, distance, and even silence. The winter of 1943 arrived. Early, the wind cut like a razor, and the snow turned the ground into a white, silent tomb. The men in the trenches no longer knew how to differentiate cold from pain, yesterday from today. Everything was a mixture of fear, tiredness, and survival. It was in this scenario that Konstantin met Alexander Volkov, a robust sergeant with stone eyes and hands calloused from ancient battles. Alexander had already served on other fronts. He was a man of few words, used to seeing death up close, and expected nothing else from life, just to survive. They were assigned to the same outpost, a precarious shelter dug into the frozen earth, surrounded by mines and distant roars. It was a mud hole, but it was what they called home. Alexander always sat in the corner, close to the rifle. Konstantin, on the other side, with his notebook on his lap. At first, they barely exchanged words, but one night, after an intense bombardment, Alexander saw Konstantin doodling by the dim light of a candle. Curious, or maybe just sleepless, he asked. "What do you write, boy?" Konstantin looked at him, surprised by the initiative. He answered honestly, "Letters, to someone who might never read." Alexander didn't laugh. He didn't even mock. He just stared at the fire for a few seconds and murmured, "Then write as if she would read it." A man needs to have something to return to, even if it's in words. From that day on, a strange friendship began to be born. Alexander didn't say much, but he listened. Sometimes I asked to hear an excerpt. Others asked about Yelena, and as the days piled up like rubble, he became not just a trench companion, but the keeper of Konstantin's words. One morning, as the snow fell in silence, Alexander surprised the young man. "My wife's name was Irina. She died before the war. I haven't written since, but hearing you talk about her reminds me of who I was before this." Konstantin listened respectfully, and that same night, he wrote Alexander's first letter to a woman who was no longer alive. It was a symbolic but powerful gesture. It was like giving him back his ability to feel, to remember, to be human. Over the months, Alexander began to protect Konstantin in subtle ways. He shared what little he had, covered him on the coldest nights, exchanged vigils so he could write, and Konstantin in turn shared his letters, his thoughts, his fears. They created a silent pact. One protected the body, the other the soul. Alexander knew that Konstantin was different. He didn't fight in anger, he didn't march with pride. He was a stranger in the midst of war, but it was also living proof that, even in hell, there could still be light. Once, after a hand-to-hand combat that left the unit in shambles, Konstantin fell to the ground, wounded, bleeding from his shoulder. Alexander carried him to the shelter, ignoring his own sprained ankle. As the young man tried to breathe, he took a piece of paper from his coat and asked, "If I fall before you, promise to write to her, even if it's just a line. Tell her I remembered." Konstantin swore, with a choked voice, "With my heart in pieces." Because there, in the midst of chaos, two men had found something very rare: fraternity, brotherhood, link, not of blood, but of pain and humanity. It was Alexander who began to keep Konstantin's letters in organized packages, wrapped in oilcloth, hidden in secret compartments inside his backpack. He was the one who remembered the dates, who warned him when a letter was incomplete, who suggested that he write more about the good days, even if they were rare. "She needs to know you laughed, even if just once. She needs to know that you still love the world, even in pieces." Alexander, the man who swore he no longer believed in love, had become the biggest defender of Konstantin's words, because, deep down, he knew what the young man wrote was more powerful than any rifle. They were seeds in arid soil. They were traces of beauty where everything was ugly, and perhaps Alexander knew or felt that that notebook would be more important than any medal, that those letters would one day need to find their destination, and that, if fate didn't want to cooperate, he would take care of it himself. Their friendship was not marked by grand gestures or declarations. It was made up of looks, understood silences, and genuine care. In a world where everything was brutal, they formed a space of humanity, and that was precious. Konstantin's trench companion would become much more than a friend. He would become the guardian of history, and without him, perhaps Yelena would never have discovered that, even without answers, someone wrote out of love until the last day. The day dawned with a strange light. A heavy gray sky covered the battlefield like a silent omen. It was as if even time itself knew something was about to happen. The trenches were wet, covered in snow and mud. The men, exhausted, no longer spoke much. They just waited. They feared. They felt. Konstantin woke up before the others, as usual. not because of the cold, but because of habit, and because of a dream. He had dreamed of Yelena, but it wasn't just any dream, it was vivid. She was sitting in front of the fireplace, reading one of her letters, smiling. Then he would get up, walk towards him, hug him, and then disappear into the smoke. He woke up with teary eyes and an urgency that he couldn't explain. He took the notebook out of his coat. The leather was already worn. The pages were damp in some places, but the words resisted. The pen was almost dry, but there was still some ink left, enough for one last letter. That morning he wrote with shaking hands. Every word was like a sigh. He didn't use poetry or metaphors. He wrote with a naked heart. Yelena, today I felt her presence so strong that I could almost touch her. I dreamed of you. I saw your smile. I heard your voice. I don't know how to explain it, but something inside me says this could be my last day. And if so, I want you to know that I loved you until the end. My words were my way of surviving, and you, the reason for each of them. If these lines reach you, then even if I don't come back, I'll know that a part of me lived to the end. When he finished, he closed his eyes for a moment. He took a deep breath. Then he handed the letter to Alexander. If something happens, promise you'll give it to her. Even if it takes a while, even if the world ends, promise. Alexander, who was not a man of easy promises, just looked him in the eyes and said, I promise. A few hours later, the calm was shattered. A surprise attack took the camp by storm. The bombs began to fall without warning, as if the sky had been ripped apart. Men ran, screamed, fell. It was the kind of horror that not even Konstantin's words could describe. Alexander ran alongside him, trying to take cover behind the rubble. The two were separated for seconds when an explosion ripped through the trench. When the dust settled, Alexander found him lying down. Konstantin had blood on the right side of his chest. His eyes were half open, breathing with difficulty. He still held the notebook. Hey kid, hold on, let's get out of here, Alexander whispered, trying to stop the blood with what he had. But Konstantin knew. His eyes said, the pain was great, but there was peace on his face, as if, somehow, he was prepared. You promised, he murmured, in a faint voice. Alexander nodded, swallowing the tears that insisted on coming. He took the notebook and placed it carefully inside his coat. He shook Konstantin's hand, and in that gesture, he sealed a friendship that death could not erase. Minutes later, Konstantin's body gave way. Alexander stayed there for a while. Even with the gunfire still around, he protected his friend's body as best he could. And when they finally managed to retreat, he carried him. I couldn't leave him there. I couldn't abandon him to the dust of war. Konstantin was buried in a small clearing, with a makeshift cross made of branches. Alexander stuck a piece of paper at the top, where he wrote just one sentence. He loved it until the end, but he didn't bury the notebook, not the letter. This, he knew, was more than paper. It was a soul pulsing, a mission. After that day, Alexander was no longer the same. I carried a weight on my chest, not just grief, but commitment. He had promised, and even if he had to cross the country on foot, he would find Yelena. She needed to know. I needed to read it. She needed to feel that, until his last breath, Konstantin was hers. Completely. Konstantin's last day was not one of military glory, nor of headline-grabbing heroism. It was silent, painful, deeply human. But it was also the day that love conquered fear, in which a promise was sealed, and that, even though he died, he continued to live. The war was over, but the silence that followed was noisier than any bombing. There was no celebration in Alexander's eyes, just a void that is difficult to fill. He saw his companions hug families, return to destroyed homes and try to rebuild what was left of their lives. But he had a mission. While others returned to find what they lost, Alexander carried with him someone who could no longer return. Konstantin, tucked away in his chest, as if it were a precious artifact, was the leather-bound notebook, worn, dirty, torn at some edges, but whole where it mattered most. In the words, inside it, were dozens of letters written with love, with fear, with faith, and among them, the most important, the last. Alexander left alone. No weapons, no uniform, no exact route, with just a name, a village, and a vague image in memory. Yelena's description. I knew she was a teacher, that she lived near a school, and that she had red hair like copper in the sun. It took days to get to Smolensk. The city was unrecognizable, destroyed. Streets, empty houses, ghosts wandering among the rubble. But there was life there too. Children playing with stones, old men planting something among the ruins, women spreading sheets that were no longer white. And in some corner of that broken city, she could still be there. Alexander knocked from door to door. He asked about Yelena Mirova, respectfully but urgently. Some shook their heads, others looked at him suspiciously, until an elderly woman, sitting in front of an improvised bakery, recognized him from his description. The girl with the sad eyes. Yes, she's still here, always has been. She pointed to a small wooden house, set back, simple but alive. It was there. Alexander took a deep breath. For the first time since the end of the war, he felt the weight of the mission he carried becoming real. He climbed the 3 steps of the porch with slow steps. He knocked on the door with his hand firm, but his heart trembling. Yelena opened it. She was different from Konstantin's descriptions. Thinner, shorter hair, more tired eyes. But there was still something about her that glowed. A kind of silent strength that Alexander recognized instantly. It was her. "Try?" he asked, surprised to see a stranger. He took off his hat, respectfully. "Are you Yelena Mirova?" She nodded, hesitantly. Alexander then took the notebook out of his coat. His calloused hands held him with an almost religious reverence. He handed the object to her with a look that said it all he wrote, every day. The world seemed to stop at that moment. Yelena put her hands over her mouth, her eyes wide. He took the notebook as if it were a sacred relic, as if he had waited for that moment in each of his silent days. "Konstantin," he whispered, as if the name were a forgotten prayer, finally uttered again. She sat right there on the doorsteps. The tears came effortlessly now. His hands shook as he flipped through the pages. Each line was a reunion, each sentence a breath of life. Alexander remained standing, silent, respecting that moment, as if he were in front of something sacred. He didn't. He stopped writing. He asked, through tears. "Never," replied Alexander, even without answers, even injured, even on the last day. He then took the last letter from his pocket, folded, sealed with a cloth thread. That was the last one. He gave it to me before leaving. Yelena held the letter to her chest. He cried in silence for a few seconds. Then he looked at Alexander with gratitude, pain and relief at the same time. "Thank you for keeping your promise." Alexander nodded. "I didn't say anything else." That mission was over. But inside, he felt like he was leaving more than a notebook behind. He left a part of his own soul. The war had taken him inside, but by fulfilling Konstantin's wish, he regained a forgotten part of himself. Before leaving, Yelena called out to him, "Stay for tea, at least today. You're part of it now." And so, for the first time in a long time, Alexander sat at the table with a slight smile. It wasn't happiness, but it was peace. That night, Yelena's small house was silent. Not the cold silence of absence, but the reverent silence of someone who is faced with something too profound to be interrupted. Alexander had already left. He refused to stay more than a day. He said the story was no longer his. It was time to let it live where it belonged, in the hands of those who inspired each word. Yelena spent hours with Konstantin's notebook on her lap. He leafed through the pages as if he were leafing through his own past, rediscovering the days he thought he had lost. And as she read, she understood. She was never alone. Even without receiving a response, he was with her, every day. Each page was a reunion, a memory that she didn't experience, but that she could now feel. Konstantin had written about everything: the cold, the fear, the moments of brief joy, the companions he made and lost. But most of all, he wrote about her. And that made each letter seem like a mirror, as if, in each word, he said, "You kept me alive." She read it aloud, as if speaking to him through time. "Today, I remembered the smell of your hair after the rain. I closed my eyes and, for a few seconds, I wasn't here anymore. I was with you. If I don't come back, don't cry for me. Read me, because my words are all I have to leave." It was then that Yelena realized something devastating. None of the letters he had sent reached her. None. There were mentions of letters sent, references to dates, excerpts that said, "I hope this one reaches you," but she had never received a single line. The war, with its bureaucratic cruelty, had erased this link. Maybe censorship, maybe misplaced, maybe neglect. The reason no longer mattered. The reality was clear. Everything she expected, she expected in vain, and even so, she didn't stop loving. The pain of knowing this was profound. A part of her rebelled, wanted to scream, wanted to ask the world why. How was such a great love condemned to silence? How did such vivid words become buried in time? But another part, larger and quieter, felt peace. Yes, she didn't receive the letters, but he wrote them, and that changed everything. Because now she knew, she was never forgotten, she was never left behind. As the world fell apart, there was someone holding his name like an anchor, like a prayer. For a long time, Yelena blamed herself for not having insisted. More, for not having followed through, for not having written in other ways, for perhaps not having believed enough. But upon reading what Konstantin had left, all guilt was dissolved in tears. She understood that it was not a lack of love, but an excess of obstacles. The last letter, sealed with the small cloth thread, was the most difficult to open. She held it for hours before finally breaking the seal. The hands were shaking. My heart beat as if it were the first time I had seen him, and when he read it, his soul collapsed. Yelena, if this letter reaches you, it is because someone honored my last promise. If I'm alive, it's because the world was kind. If I'm not, it's because life was brief, but it was worth it for loving you. You were my home, even far away. You were my peace, even in war. And now, you are the keeper of my words. Don't cry for me, read me, feel me, and live, for both of us. Yelena lay down that night hugging the notebook, as if it were him. For the first time in years, she dreamed of him not silently, but smiling, talking, writing. The truth revealed was painful, yes, but it was also liberating. What had been trapped in his soul for so long had finally been completed. Now, she understood why she waited. Why didn't you give up? Because, even without knowing it, she was being loved, intensely, every day. Konstantin's notebook, previously hidden at the bottom of a combat backpack, now rested on a light wooden table, near the window where soft sunlight streamed in. It was there that Yelena spent her afternoons, since the day Alexander entrusted those pages to her. There, she read, rewrite, and he cried, but not with sadness. They were tears of gratitude, of healing, of reunion. His words no longer belonged to her. Alone Yelena knew that. There was something sacred in those lines, something universal. What he wrote in the trenches was not just a personal love letter. It was a testimony of what resists, even when everything tries to destroy. And so, she made a decision. The letters needed to be read by more people. With her heart still in pieces, but with her soul awakened, Yelena took the pages, separated them by dates, organized the loose notes, and started typing everything on an old typewriter borrowed from the school. Each keystroke was a beat of Konstantin's heart that refused to die. She didn't cut anything. He didn't improve sentences. He didn't ease the pain. Kept everything as it was, raw, real, human. The project took months. Every day, a new pain was reread, and a new spark of strength was born. Children came knocking on the door, curious about the sound of the machine. Neighbors started asking. And then, when the manuscript was ready, Yelena did something even bigger. She looked for a small printing company in the city, explaining that she didn't want to sell it, just share it. He ordered 100 copies. He used everything he had saved. The first copy was given to Alexander, who returned to the village after receiving a letter from her. When he read the title on the cover, War Letters for Yelena, he couldn't contain his tears. He just said, "He's still alive." Then, and he clutched the book to his chest. Letters began to circulate, first in the village, then in nearby cities. A teacher read an excerpt to his class. One woman included one of the letters in her daily prayer. A young man in love wrote his first love letter, inspired by Konstantin. Before long, the words of a soldier who wrote without knowing if they would be read began to touch lives he would never know. Some were crying. Others remained silent for long minutes after reading. But everyone felt it, because there was truth there. There was beauty amidst the chaos. There was a love so real that it disarmed even the most skeptical. Local newspapers began publishing excerpts. One of them wrote, "The soldier who wrote against death," a story that reminds us of what is essential. And so, without ever having intended to be known, Konstantin became a symbol of something bigger. The voice of those who loved in silence, who resisted with words, who transformed pain into beauty. Yelena started receiving letters to people who had lost someone in the war, and said that when they read Konstantin, they felt they were listening to their own sons, husbands, brothers. It was as if he had written for all of them. It was as if love, when poured onto paper, had become collective. But perhaps the most beautiful part came from a group of young students. Inspired by the letters, they began writing to people who were alone, widows, orphans, wounded soldiers. They called the movement Words That Heal. It all started with Konstantin. Yelena, even with her heart still in mourning, felt alive like never before. Because now she understood. She wasn't just the recipient of the letters. She was the bridge. She was the guardian. It was the fertile field where the words he planted flourished in other souls. And at night, when closing the windows of the house, she looked at the sky and said, "You won, my love. The world tried to silence your voice, but it echoes louder than ever." In the bedroom, the original notebook remained untouched inside a box covered with blue fabric, a reliquary. From time to time, Yelena would open it and run her fingers over the pages, as if touching something sacred. I no longer needed the answers that never came. Now, she had all the answers she needed. He never stopped loving, he never stopped writing, and his words survived. Over the years, Konstantin's letters did not lose strength. On the contrary, they seemed to take on a life of their own. Each new reading, each new person touched, was as if he was writing again, even after he was dead. And that's why Yelena understood that love needed a place where it could live forever. It was one spring afternoon that the idea came up. She was walking around the old school, where she had once again taught, when she passed by the old oak tree where she and Konstantin said goodbye. The trunk was marked by time, but still firm. The leaves danced in the wind, and for a moment she almost saw him there, sitting, smiling, with the notebook in his lap. At that moment, she decided that would be the place. Yelena joined forces. He spoke to former students, neighbors, teachers, and everyone, without hesitation, offered to help. The oak, symbol of the beginning and end of that love, would become the center of something bigger, a living memorial. It would not be a cold monument, nor a bronze statue. It would be a space of memory and feeling, a circular garden with wooden benches carved by locals, each engraved with excerpts from Konstantin's letters. In the center, a simple plaque, in aged iron, said, "Here rests words that survived the war. Here a love blossomed that not even death could silence." The letters were printed in a new, more elaborate edition, with pages illustrated by local artists. Schools started to use the material in literature and history classes. Children did dramatizations with the cards. Young people wrote their own letters to the future, and visitors left notes, poems, flowers, and promises by the oak tree, as if they were talking to Konstantin. The story spread. Cultural magazines, journalists, university professors. Everyone wanted to see the village where a soldier wrote to the end for love, and a woman waited until the last day for her truth. People from all over the country came to visit that small piece of land, but none more so than Alexander. He always came back once a year. I sat on the farthest bench and read in silence, always alone, always with the original notebook on your lap, until one day, he left it there. He delivered it to the memorial with the following handwritten dedication. "This notebook belongs to the world now, but every line is still his." Yelena, now with gray hair, but with her eyes still firm, was still present. She told the story to anyone who would listen. I didn't dramatize. It didn't turn into a legend. It counted on simplicity, as if speaking of something very true, as if speaking of someone who still lives in their words. A reporter once asked her, "Do you regret not moving on, not having another love?" Yelena smiled, and he responded with the sweetness of someone who is no longer in a hurry. "I have lived long enough for many. I have lived through his words, and the right words are worth a lifetime." The memorial has become something more than a tourist spot turned refuge. People went there to write letters that would never be sent, to read aloud names that had been silenced by war, by time, by life. And on each of these visits, Konstantin was present. There were those who said that the place had a different energy, that as he sat there, under the oak, he felt as if the world was slowing down, as if time went back a little. And maybe it was true, because true love has that power. And then one day, many years later, a 10-year-old girl sat in front of Yelena with a letter in her hands. He said he had written to someone he hadn't met yet, but that he hoped to meet one day. He handed her the letter and asked, "Do you think he will answer me?" Yelena held the girl's hand, smiled, and replied, "If it's true love, he's already started writing." At that moment, she understood that the memorial was not just about the past, was seed for the future. It was a memory, yes, but it was also hope, because Konstantin's words did not die with him. They didn't even stop with her. They followed, they rang, they healed, they inspired. The love that began with a letter hidden in a book now lived in every flower in that garden, in every child's laugh, in every respectful silence before the oak. It was a memorial, yes, but it was alive, because some stories don't end, they transform. The story of Konstantin and Yelena is not just a war story. It is, above all, a story about what makes us human. As the world exploded around them, as the trenches swallowed futures, and time seemed to collapse on the shoulders of those who just wanted to love and be loved, there was someone who wrote. He wrote every day, not knowing if anyone would read it. He wrote with faith, in pain, truly, and there was someone who waited, who believed, even when everything around screamed, that there was nothing left to wait for. She held tight to an absence for years, and even in silence, she never stopped loving. This story reminds us that love does not need to be perfect, nor reciprocated, nor easy, to be eternal. True love is the one that insists, who writes, that survives, even when there are no guarantees, even when everything falls apart. Konstantin's letters are more than souvenirs. They are proof that the written word has power, that a feeling, when put on paper, takes shape, takes on a soul, and can cross time, distance, and even death. Yelena lived without hugs, without answers, but she didn't live without love, because love, sometimes, is not what you receive, but what you keep, what you care for, what you choose to protect, even when the world wants to erase it. They never physically met again, but in every line of that notebook, Konstantin was present. With each reading, Yelena welcomed him back. With each tear that fell on the paper, a piece of absence was washed away. And now, all of us who heard this story got a little of them too. You who have been watching this far may have remembered someone. Maybe I'm waiting too, or writing. Maybe I kept feelings that the world didn't understand. But no, the love that refuses to die is the love that lives the longest. And if Konstantin were here, perhaps he would say this: I didn't write to be remembered. I wrote it because loving you kept me alive. And if those words reached other hearts, then I never left. If this story touched your heart, show that it is worth telling. Leave a like, share with someone who needs to feel this, and subscribe to the channel. Here, each story is written from the soul, and you are part of it now. And remember, we can't always get back to the ones we love, but sometimes we leave words that come back for us. Until the next story, if you've made it this far, it's because this story spoke to you in a way that you might not even be able to explain in words. So please, reciprocate this emotion with a simple but powerful gesture. Leave a like now. This shows me that it's worth continuing to bring stories like this. Intense, real, that touch the heart. And if this moved you, imagine what's yet to come. Have you ever thought about how many other stories like this are still waiting to be told? Here, each video is a letter, each story a reunion, and every person who signs up is part of something much bigger. So, don't leave without subscribing to the channel. Click on the button, activate the bell, and come be part of this community of people who believe in love, memory, and the power of words. If Konstantin wrote to the end, we will continue reading together.